In 1650, the most famous painter in Spain unveiled a portrait so striking that Rome's art elite couldn't stop arguing about it. What nobody guessed was that the man staring back from the canvas was legally forbidden to even paint. Juan de Pareja went from mixing pigments in secret, risking everything, to forcing the world to see his genius up close. Think about that, a man who wasn't supposed to leave a mark on history, leaving one that still stares you down centuries later. Centuries later, people still look at Pareja and wonder not just how he learned to paint, but who dared to teach him. Think about that, in a world designed to hide his talent, who noticed the quiet ambition burning behind the apprentice's silence, and why did they decide to risk everything for it? Stay with me, because this story is not just about stolen brushstrokes, but about the impossible alliances that made them possible. If you want stories like this to reach those who need them most, subscribe now. Your support brings overlooked voices out of the shadows and into the light. The portrait sits in a museum now, but once the man in that painting was simply another shadow moving through the chaos of early 17th century Spain. Juan de Pareja's world began in the city of Antequera, Andalusia, around 1606, where life was dictated by the sharp lines of ancestry and the unspoken rules of who belonged. His mother, Zulema, was a woman of African descent, possibly Moorish and already enslaved when he was born. His father was a Spaniard, though his name faded into history as quickly as it appeared. From his first breath, Pareja's future was decided for him. In Spain, the child of a slave inherited that status from the mother, no matter the father's name, face, or intentions. So, from the moment he entered the world, Juan was property, not person. Antequera was no stranger to the movement of bodies and fortunes. By the time Juan was born, Spain's cities pulsed with the presence of black and Moorish people, some free, most not. In Seville, just down the road, slaves made up nearly 10% of the population. The city's wealth, its art, its very heartbeat, depended on the labor of people like his mother. Zulema was described as a Morisco, a convert from Islam, and in the Spain of that era, her mixed heritage marked her out twice over, first by her skin, and again by the suspicion that she carried faith and customs not quite cleansed by baptism. The expulsion of the Moors was still fresh in memory. Her son's very existence was a reminder of the centuries when Spain's rulers tried to erase the traces of Africa and Islam, even as both lingered in the blood and language of its people. Juan's earliest memories would have been shaped by the routines of servitude, rising before dawn, listening for the footsteps of masters, learning when to speak and when to stay silent. He watched his mother navigate the shifting moods of those who claimed to own her, and maybe wondered what it meant to belong to someone else. The city around him was filled with the sights and sounds of Spain's golden age, merchants shouting in crowded markets, robed priests moving through whitewashed streets, artists sketching the world as it was and as they wished it to be. But for all the glory and noise, there was an invisible wall that divided the world in two, those who created and those who simply enabled creation, always in the background, never leaving a mark. By the time Pareja was a boy, Spain's laws had already drawn a hard line around what was possible for someone of his background. Enslaved people could not join the artists' guilds, could not sign their names to paintings, could not claim credit for anything their hands produced. Even the act of learning to paint was forbidden. If an enslaved man showed too much ambition or dared to reach above his station, the penalty could be severe: punishment, sale, or exile from the city altogether. The rules were clear, and they were meant to last. Juan's life changed when he was acquired by Diego Velázquez, the painter whose fame would one day circle the globe. Madrid was the capital now, a city where power and art mingled in the halls of the royal court. Velázquez, a man celebrated for painting kings and queens, was given permission to bring a young slave into his household. That boy was Juan. He left behind the world he knew for the bustling streets and candlelit studios of Madrid, where his days became a blur of labor and observation. He cleaned brushes, stretched canvases, and ground pigments until his fingers stung, all in service of another man's vision. The studio was a place of discipline and hierarchy, but it was also a living classroom. Velázquez worked in the manner of his own master, Francisco Pacheco, demanding careful draftsmanship and a relentless attention to detail. Juan's tasks were repetitive, but they were also instructive. He watched as Velázquez mapped out compositions with the faintest marks, mixed colors with a precision that seemed more alchemy than craft, and coaxed light from darkness with every stroke. The rhythms of painting seeped into Juan's bones, even if nobody expected him to use them for himself. But here's where the story starts to slip from the record. No one wrote down the first time Pareja reached for a brush when Velázquez left the room, or how he traced the outlines of faces in leftover paint, hoping his efforts would go unnoticed. He must have known the risks. Spanish law did not simply frown on the ambition of an enslaved person, it considered it a threat to the entire social order. Still, the urge to create could not be contained by fear alone. Juan's education was built on stolen moments, borrowed glances, and the quiet absorption of everything happening around him. Imagine what that required: the patience to wait for opportunity, the discipline not to be discovered, and the hope that one day the world might look past the label of slave and see something more. Yet for years that hope had to stay hidden. In Velázquez's studio, Juan de Pareja was invisible in plain sight, a pair of hands, a shadow moving between easels, his own ambitions pressed down beneath the weight of daily toil. Madrid itself was a city of contradictions during these years, the court dazzled with pageantry, commissioning paintings to immortalize royal victories and family lineages, while in the alleys and side streets poverty gnawed at the edges of grandeur. The golden age of Spanish art was fueled by the hidden labor of people like Pareja, who supplied the sweat and skill but were kept out of the spotlight. The city's guilds, the very institutions that protected and promoted artists, drew their rules from the same logic that kept Pareja silent. Only those of pure blood could claim the title of master. For an enslaved man of African and Moorish descent, the doors stayed shut. Yet, proximity counted for something. In Velázquez's studio, Juan saw more than most free men ever would. He watched the way rich pigments were ground, how canvases were prepared and stretched until perfectly taut, how the master tested the balance of light and shadow by candlelight. The secrets of the Baroque, the tricks of chiaroscuro, the layering of glazes, the subtle blending of tones were all there if you knew how to look. Over time, Juan became not just a servant, but a silent witness to the making of masterpieces. There were whispers among the other assistants, perhaps, or knowing glances exchanged when Pareja lingered a little too long at the easel. But nobody challenged the arrangement. Velázquez had the king's favor, and his household ran on loyalty and discretion. Sometimes, Juan was sent to purchase rare pigments from distant merchants. Other times he was tasked with copying sketches, making sure that the master's ideas could be tested and refined before anything touched the final canvas. With every errand, every repeated task, the mechanics of painting became more familiar, more accessible. But the line between observation and creation remained razor-thin and dangerous. Pareja must have wondered if the skills he gathered in secret would ever find a purpose beyond serving someone else's genius. Each day was a gamble, every experiment a risk that could unravel the fragile piece of the studio. If he was caught painting in secret, the consequences could be swift and brutal, a public beating, a forced sale, or worse. Yet he persisted, driven by the stubborn conviction that there was more to life than anonymous service. He was not the first to dream of escape, but he was among the few who dared to reach for a different kind of freedom, the chance to create, to leave a mark that nobody could erase. Outside the studio, the wider world was shifting. The Spanish Empire was vast but beginning to show cracks. Wars drained the treasury, and the court's extravagance masked a growing sense of instability. In this climate, the arts became both a distraction and a weapon, proof that Spain remained a beacon of culture and power, even as its grip weakened abroad. Velázquez's paintings were celebrated as symbols of national greatness, but the hands that prepared those canvases, mixed those colors, and swept the floors at night remained nameless. For Juan de Pareja, anonymity was both a shield and a prison. Still, there were moments when the boundaries softened. Velázquez, Perhaps recognizing a spark in his assistant allowed him greater access to the materials and the process, if not the title of painter. It was never spoken aloud, but Juan's presence became indispensable. He learned when to ask questions and when to simply watch, when to push for more responsibility, and when to fade into the background. The studio became a world within a world, one where the rules could be bent, if not broken, for those willing to risk everything. But all these years of silent apprenticeship, all the patience and danger, led to a single electrifying question that would change the course of Juan de Pareja's life forever. What happens when the world's greatest painter decides to make his assistant the subject, not the servant, of a portrait? The answer to that question would upend everything Pareja thought he knew about art, freedom, and the cost of being seen. But before that moment could arrive, there were more risks to take, more secrets to keep, and a final fateful journey that would push both master and apprentice into the heart of Rome, where the eyes of the world would soon be watching. The question that hung in the air, what happens when the world's greatest painter asks his enslaved assistant to sit for a portrait, did not have an obvious answer at first. For years, Juan de Pareja had been a shadow at the edge of the frame. He blended into the background of Madrid's grandest studio, his own ambitions hidden behind the grind of daily labor and the constant threat of punishment. Yet, with Velázquez's invitation, everything changed. It was no small thing. In the world of 17th century Spain, a master did not simply paint his slave. That gesture alone was a ripple against centuries of hierarchy. But this was not just any master, and not just any slave. The moment came not in the safe anonymity of Madrid, but in Rome, where the eyes of the world watched and judged with a ferocity unknown in Spain. The trip itself had been a risk, a journey into the heart of Catholic power, where reputations were forged or destroyed in a single season. Velázquez had official business, commissions for the Spanish crown, audiences with cardinals, a chance to study the old masters and test his own genius on the grandest stage. Pareja officially was just a servant. He carried materials, cleaned up, fetched food and news, but every day in Rome he breathed in the air of possibility. He saw the swirl of artists from every corner of Europe, each one hungry for attention. He watched as Velázquez moved through this world with confidence, the king's man in a city ruled by the Pope. But Rome was also a city of masks. Here, talent mattered, but so did birth and status. For a man like Pareja, every street was a reminder of the limits set on him by law and blood. He was not supposed to be seen. He was not supposed to matter, yet in the spring of 1650, Velázquez broke that unspoken rule. He set up his easel, prepared the canvas, and called Pareja to stand where only noblemen and dignitaries usually sat. Imagine the shock, his own shock most of all. For once, he was not being painted as a nameless servant in the background, but as a subject in his own right. The master studied his features, searching for the truth that others overlooked, and began to work. What nobody guessed was that this was not just an act of kindness. It was a test, a message, and a provocation all at once. Velázquez was gambling with his own reputation, daring the world to see Pareja not as property, but as a man with presence, dignity, and story. The brush did not flatter, but it did not diminish. It captured the resolve in Pareja's eyes, the curve of his mouth that held back what must have been a storm of questions. Why me? Why now? What will this mean tomorrow? The city outside the studio was buzzing with rumors. Some whispered that Velázquez was preparing for his most important commission yet, a portrait of Pope Innocent X. But before he could paint the Pope, he needed to prove himself in Rome. Therefore, he chose the most unlikely sitter in his circle, the enslaved assistant whose skill and loyalty had anchored his studio for years. What did Pareja feel as he sat beneath the cold northern light of Rome, watched by the man who owned him, knowing every stroke could change not only how others saw him, but how he saw himself? Was it terror, pride, hope, or all three tangled together? The rules said that his body belonged to someone else, but for those hours, his face became the center of the canvas, the center of attention, the center of a new story. The act itself was radical. Spanish law was clear. Slaves could not join the artists' guilds, could not sign their own names, could not claim the dignity of creation. Yet here was Velázquez painting not just a likeness but a challenge to the world's assumptions. When the portrait was finished, Velázquez did not hide it away. He did the unthinkable. He unveiled it in public at the Pantheon during the Feast of St. Joseph, when Rome's art world gathered to see and be seen. Think about that, in a city where even free men of mixed ancestry were kept at the margins. Here was an enslaved man, painted in the grand manner with all the dignity reserved for princes, gazing out at the crowd. The response was electric. The portrait astonished Rome. People argued about it in the streets and salons. Some refused to believe the sitter was a slave. Others whispered that Velázquez had gone too far, that he had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. But the truth was out. For the first time, Pareja was seen not as a tool but as a human being, a presence that could not be ignored. The portrait was more than a painting. It was a statement, a rupture in the old order. It asked a question that made everyone uncomfortable. If a slave could look like this, so composed, so intelligent, so unmistakably himself, then what did that say about the world that kept him in chains? The painting forced people to see what they had long tried to avoid. This was the moment when the balance of power shifted. Velázquez had thrown his weight behind his assistant, staking his own reputation on the gamble that genius could not be confined by birth or blood. But the risk was not his alone. For Pareja, nothing was guaranteed. He was still legally enslaved. The laws of Spain still threatened severe punishment for any step out of line. Recognition brought its own dangers. Therefore, the portrait's success was both a blessing and a burden. It made Pareja visible. It made him vulnerable. Behind the scenes, the stakes grew higher. The portrait's reception cracked open new possibilities, but also new uncertainties. Would Velázquez protect him, or would the backlash make things worse? What would happen when they returned to Spain, where the guilds and courts did not share Rome's fascination with the exotic and the extraordinary? Nobody could say for sure, but Velázquez acted again. In November of that same year, he signed a Manumission document in Rome, agreeing to grant Pareja his freedom after 4 more years of service. It was not immediate liberty, but it was a promise, a door left ajar. Think about how that must have felt. For years, Pareja's only hope had been to remain unnoticed, to survive by blending in. Now, suddenly, the whole world was looking at him, debating his right to exist as more than a shadow. He had been painted free before he was free. The transformation was not complete, not yet. There were still years of obligation, still long nights of uncertainty, still the risk that the fragile promise could be taken back with a word. But the portrait had changed everything. It had made Pareja an exception, a name, and a face that could not be erased. The man who had spent his life learning in secret now found himself at the center of the stage, yet the very recognition that lifted him up also marked him out. He was no longer invisible, but that meant there was nowhere to hide. So what happens next, when the walls of anonymity fall away and the world demands to know if the man in the portrait is truly what he appears to be? The answer is not simple. For Juan de Pareja, the years that followed would test every lesson he had learned, every skill he had stolen in silence, and every ounce of courage he had managed to hold on to. The struggle was far from over. In fact, it was only beginning. What nobody guessed, standing in front of that portrait in Rome, was just how many battles Juan de Pareja had to fight before he could ever step into the light. The portrait may have made him visible, but every day that followed was a test of whether he could survive being seen. Freedom, as it turned out, was not a single moment. It was a series of narrow escapes, careful calculations, and reminders that the old rules were never far behind. The world had changed for a heartbeat, but the old order waited for any sign of weakness. The first real test came almost immediately after the portrait's unveiling. Rome's art world was buzzing, but back in the Spanish embassy, whispers turned into pointed questions. Rumors swirled that Velázquez's assistant, the one whose face now hung in the Pantheon, had been seen copying sketches after hours, brush in hand, working on something not meant for the master's eyes. One evening, as the moon slipped through the shutters, the studio's door creaked open. Pareja froze, brush poised above an unfinished study. In the doorway stood Antonio de Barbera, a junior painter hoping to curry favor with the Spanish court. He watched in silence, lips pressed tight. Finally he muttered, "You know this is forbidden." Pareja's heart hammered in his chest. He did not answer. Barbera stepped inside, his shadow stretching across the canvas. "If you're caught," Barbera said, "they'll send you back to Spain in chains." That threat hung heavy in the night air. Still, Pareja did not put down the brush. He risked everything on a single gamble, that Barbera cared more about his own ambitions than about enforcing the law. For hours, he waited for the other man to betray him. But by sunrise, Barbera was gone, and the secret held. Pareja's hands shook as he hid the evidence, knowing that every finished line was another step closer to disaster. What nobody outside the studio could see was just how thin that line had become. But the legal world moved slowly, and Rome's excitement soon faded into suspicion. Word of the portrait's impact reached the Spanish guilds, where the rules about blood and birth were carved in stone. In Madrid, the Limpieza de Sangre statutes were being recited in back rooms, names checked, records searched for any excuse to deny what the painting suggested, that a black man of Moorish descent could be more than a background figure. When Pareja returned to Spain with Velázquez, the atmosphere shifted from dangerous possibility to outright hostility. The guild elders summoned Velázquez to answer for himself. "You have set a dangerous precedent," one of them warned. "If he paints, the order will unravel." Velázquez, unflinching, replied, "He is my assistant, and I have given him tasks as I see fit." The elders did not press further that day, but it was clear the new freedoms granted in Rome did not automatically cross the Pyrenees. For Pareja, each commission Velázquez accepted meant another round of scrutiny, another risk that the fragile arrangement would snap. Every time he opened a paint box or stretched a canvas, he wondered if someone was watching. A different kind of challenge came in the form of jealousy and rivalry within the studio walls. Not all of Velázquez's circle were silent witnesses. In 1651, as the workshop prepared the grand canvases bound for the Escorial, an older apprentice named Martin Ortega took issue with Pareja's growing confidence. During a tense afternoon, Ortega cornered him by the pigment table. "You think Rome changed you?" "You're still the help," he sneered, grabbing a jar of precious ultramarine and holding it just out of reach. Pareja did not rise to the bait. He simply stared at Ortega, letting the silence stretch. But that night, someone sabotaged one of Pareja's practice panels, scraping away the underpainting and leaving a mocking note tucked behind the easel, "Know your place." The message was clear. For every small victory, there was a reminder that old resentments had not disappeared. Pareja responded the only way he knew, by returning early the next morning, repairing the damage, and starting again. There was no room for anger, only persistence. Still, the threat of sabotage lingered, a warning that not all wounds were visible. Meanwhile, freedom itself was a moving target. The Manumission document Velázquez signed in Rome was real, but its promise was delayed, 4 more years of service before full emancipation. Some nights, Pareja lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if that promise would hold. In 1652, Madrid was gripped by a wave of unrest. The king's treasury was empty, and rumors spread that the court would seize assets wherever it could. One morning, a royal official arrived at Velázquez's door with a list of names, searching for property that might be liquidated to pay debts. Pareja's name was there, inked alongside household items and livestock. Velázquez intervened, producing the manumission agreement, but the official hesitated. "The law is the law," he said, finger-tracing the line. "If you die before he is freed, he reverts to the crown." That possibility, cold and bureaucratic, haunted Pareja for months. Every cough from Velázquez, every rumor of illness was a fresh reminder that his future depended on the whims of men who saw him as inventory. The promise of freedom was real, but it was fragile, and every day carried the risk that it might be snatched away on a technicality. The years dragged on, and with them, the struggle to claim his place as a painter in his own right. By 1654, when the last condition of his manumission was fulfilled, Pareja walked into the notary's office in Madrid to sign his Carta de Libertad. The room was small, the candles guttering, the notary's pen scratching slow and deliberate. "State your name," the official said. Pareja did, voice steady. The notary paused. "Occupation?" This was the moment that mattered. "Pater," Pareja replied. There was a flicker of doubt in the clerk's eyes, a hesitation as he glanced at the statutes on the wall. But the law, for once, allowed the answer to stand. Pareja left the office with a piece of paper that said he was free, but outside, the world had not changed its mind about men of his color or background. The next challenge would be convincing clients to trust his brush, no small feat in a city that still whispered about bloodlines and birthrights. Earning commissions was a battle of its own. The established artists' guilds, wary of outsiders, closed ranks. In 1656, Pareja submitted a proposal for a new altarpiece to the Church of San Gins. The committee reviewed his sketches, nodding at the composition but hesitating over the signature. Juan de Pareja, pintor. One priest, Father Rodrigo, pushed the paper aside. "We have heard of you," he said, "but is your hand your own, or does it belong to Velázquez?" The question was a dagger. Pareja replied, "The work will speak for itself." For days the committee deliberated, weighing the risk of scandal against the promise of quality. In the end, the commission went to another, less capable but more familiar name. Pareja did not protest. He returned to his rented room, unrolled the rejected sketches, and began again. For every door that closed, he searched for a window left open. Hunger and humiliation became part of the apprenticeship. Each setback was a lesson in patience, each refusal a test of resolve. But even as some doors slammed shut, others creaked open. In 1658, a small convent on the outskirts of Madrid needed a new painting for their chapel. The Mother Superior, Sister Luke A., had seen Pareja's work on a borrowed panel and decided to take a risk. She met him in the cloister garden, her hands folded, her gaze steady. "They say you were born in darkness," she said, "but this place could use a little light." Pareja painted the baptism of Christ in that quiet chapel, his brush moving with newfound confidence. The nuns watched in silence, whispering among themselves as the figures emerged from the canvas. When the work was unveiled, the congregation gasped, not because of the artist's origins, but because of the radiance he had conjured from oil and pigment. Still, outside the convent walls, the debate raged on. Some called it a miracle, others a provocation. Pareja accepted both, knowing that no triumph in public ever came without a price in private. Not every confrontation was so civil. In 1660, Velázquez died. The news hit Madrid like a thunderclap. For Pareja, the loss was more than personal, it was a sudden loss of protection. Within weeks, rival artists moved to claim Velázquez's commissions, and with him gone, Pareja's legitimacy was questioned all over again. Juan Bautista del Mazo, Velázquez's son-in-law and successor, inherited the studio and its debts. He summoned Pareja for a meeting in the Grand Salon. "The world is watching," del Mazo warned. "They will judge you by your master's absence." Pareja nodded, understanding the message beneath the words. "You are on your own now." The transition was rough. Del Mazo's apprentices resented Pareja's presence, muttering that he should have left with the old master. The moment Velázquez turned and asked Pareja to take the sitter's chair was no accident, and it changed everything for both of them. If you felt the weight of that invitation, let me know in the comments, and subscribe to help bring more hidden moments like this to the surface. Inside the Prado Museum, centuries after that first brushstroke, the portrait of Juan de Pareja still commands the room. The light catches his face just so, the same way it must have in Rome, and for a moment the distance between observer and subject disappears. But the story that lives behind those eyes is not frozen. It moves, it builds, it refuses to end at the moment the paint dried. That portrait was never just an image. It was a door, and once it opened, nothing on the other side was the same. What nobody guessed, standing in that Roman crowd, was how far Pareja would walk through it. Think about what that must have felt like. For years, every movement in Velázquez's studio had been measured, cautious, careful not to attract attention. Every mark Pareja made was a calculation, a risk balanced against survival. Then the world shifted. In 1654, 4 years after the public unveiling, Pareja stepped into the notary's office in Madrid, no longer as property, but as a man who could finally claim his own name. The clerk did not look up at first. He asked for details: name, age, place of birth. When Pareja answered painter, the word hung in the stale air for a moment, just long enough for the old laws to rattle their chains, just long enough for the past to flicker at the edge of the present. But the pen moved, the document was signed, and for the first time his status matched the dignity Velázquez had captured years before on canvas. There was no triumphal procession, no parade through the streets of Madrid. Pareja slipped quietly into freedom, just as he had slipped into the world of art, by inches, by patience, by persistence. The truth is, emancipation did not erase the old dangers. The church bells rang, the city bustled, and behind closed doors, the guild elders still whispered about bloodlines and birthrights. The Limpieza de Sangre statutes had not vanished. They simply shifted shape, now appearing as questions about his skill, his character, his right to sign his own work. Yet something fundamental had changed. He was no longer invisible. His hands were his own. For the first time, when he mixed pigment, it was not for another man's canvas. When he stretched linen, it was for a painting that would carry his signature. The next test was not legal, but professional. Pareja needed to prove that his skill was not an accident, not the residue of proximity to greatness, but something he had earned and could command. He rented a small room near the Plaza Mayor, its walls bare except for a cracked mirror and a single wooden easel. Day after day, he painted. Some pieces were for friends, others for minor churches or convents on the outskirts of Madrid. He painted saints and sinners, miracles and martyrs, each canvas a quiet argument against the idea that genius could be predicted by ancestry. The commissions were modest at first. A nun in San Gin's wanted a gentle Madonna. A merchant's widow needed a portrait to hang above her hearth. Each time, Pareja signed his name in careful script, Juan de Pareja, Pintor. The act was small but radical. Every signature was a wager that the world would not turn away. But the real breakthrough came in 1661, when the Church of San Juan Bautista, flush with new donations, announced a competition for a grand altarpiece. The subject was the calling of St. Matthew, the moment when Christ singles out the tax collector, transforming him from outsider to apostle in a single electrifying gesture. Pareja understood the symbolism at once. He submitted a sketch, careful and precise, the composition swirling with movement and light. The committee hesitated, debating his background, but the sketch drew more praise than protest. He was awarded the commission, and for months, his small studio became a hive of activity. This was no minor work. The canvas stretched nearly 8 feet high, dwarfing everything else in the room. Pareja toiled by candlelight, mixing ochres and vermilions, building layer upon layer of color, until the forms emerged with a clarity that echoed the old master's touch but spoke with a new, urgent voice. He painted Christ as both gentle and commanding, his hand reaching across the table to touch Matthew's shoulder. The faces around the table were not idealized. They were drawn from the streets of Madrid, merchants, apprentices, beggars, even a butcher's boy who posed for a few coins. And in the far corner, almost hidden but unmistakable, Pareja painted himself. Not as an observer, but as a participant in the story. He looked out from the shadows, brush in hand, as if to remind the viewer that transformation was not a miracle reserved for saints. When the painting was unveiled, the congregation gasped. The priest, older now and set in his ways, studied the canvas in silence before murmuring, "This is the work of a master." Word spread quickly. Other churches sent messengers to see the altarpiece for themselves. Even rival painters, some of whom had once dismissed Pareja as a curiosity, came to study the composition, tracing the bold lines and subtle glazes, whispering about his use of light. The rumors that had once trailed him about his origins, his status, his right to paint, began to fade, replaced by a new question: what else could he do? The commissions multiplied. A convent needed a baptism of Christ. A wealthy banker wanted a portrait of his wife and insisted on Pareja's hand. For the first time, he negotiated his own prices, bought his own supplies, and paid assistants to help with the heavy lifting. He hired a young apprentice, Tom S., the son of a freedwoman, who arrived wide-eyed and eager to learn. Pareja taught him how to stretch canvas without warping the frame, how to grind pigments until the color bloomed, how to capture the way light curved around a cheekbone. The studio grew busier, the walls filling with sketches and unfinished panels, the air thick with the smell of linseed oil and turpentine. Outside, Madrid still bristled with suspicion. Some patrons refused to hire a painter of African descent, no matter how fine his work. The guilds kept their distance, unwilling to embrace a man whose very existence challenged their rules, but the paintings themselves traveled farther than any rumor. A bishop in Toledo commissioned a small Madonna for his private chapel. The Archbishop of Seville, hearing of the altarpiece's success, sent for sketches. Even a minor noble at court, intrigued by the stories, invited Pareja to paint his daughter's wedding portrait. With every new commission, Pareja's reputation grew. He was no longer just Velázquez's former assistant or the subject of a famous portrait. He was, in the words of one patron, el pintor de las transformaciones, the painter of change. Yet, for all the public success, the most profound moments happened in private. Late at night, after the apprentices had gone, Pareja would sit in front of the portrait Velázquez had painted years before, sometimes just gazing, sometimes working on a new canvas of his own. The room was quiet, except for the soft scrape of brush on linen. It was in these hours that he realized the full meaning of what he had achieved. Every brushstroke was a rebuke to the world that had tried to keep him silent. Every finished work was proof that talent, once revealed, could not be forced back into the shadows. It was not just about survival anymore. It was about mastery of the craft, of his own story, of the right to be seen. He experimented with new techniques, blending the Spanish Baroque with flashes of Italian chiaroscuro, pushing the boundaries of color and form. In the baptism of Christ, he let the figures shimmer with light, the water almost translucent, the faces open and alive. In smaller works, he played with perspective, letting the viewer slip into the scene as if invited by the characters themselves. Each painting, no matter the subject, carried a trace of the journey that had brought him here, the quiet hunger of the early years, the dangerous devotion in Velázquez's studio, the terror and pride of being painted free before he was free, and now the steady confidence of a man who had earned his place. Clients began to seek him out not just for his skill, but for his eye, his ability to see what others missed. A young widow came to the studio with a faded miniature of her late husband, asking if Pareja could restore it. He did more than restore, he repainted the face, giving it warmth and depth, letting the memory live again in oil and light. A merchant's daughter, plain and awkward, became luminous under his brush, her shyness transformed into quiet grace. Even rival artists, once content to ignore the Moorish painter, started to send their own apprentices to observe Pareja's methods, hoping to glean some secret from the man who had crossed so many boundaries. But perhaps the most telling sign of change was what happened in the marketplace. At first, buyers hesitated, offering half the price they would pay a painter from an old family. Pareja did not argue. He let the work speak. Slowly, the prices rose. His name began to appear on receipts, on church ledgers, on letters of introduction sent from one patron to the next. He was invited to join in the annual procession of artists at Corpus Christi, his place earned not by birth but by brush. The old statutes about purity of blood still lingered in the shadows, but they had lost their power to keep him out of the sunlight. Inside the studio, Pareja took on more students. He taught not just technique, but survival. He told them to watch, to listen, to learn in the margins if that was all the world would allow. He did not promise them easy victories. He promised only that the work would be worth the wait. Some of his apprentices went on to paint quietly for small parishes. Others found their way to larger commissions. All of them, in some way, carried a piece of his story with them. The final years brought a kind of peace, though it was hard-won and never taken for granted. When Velázquez died in 1660, Madrid's art world shifted again. There were rumors that Pareja would lose his standing, that without the old master's protection, he would be pushed back to the margins. Instead, he found new allies. Juan Bautista del Mazo, Velázquez's son-in-law, recognized his skill and kept him on as a collaborator. The commissions kept coming. The studio stayed busy, and Pareja's reputation reached beyond Madrid, traveling along the dusty roads to Toledo, Segovia, and even as far as Valencia. In 1661, the calling of Saint Matthew was installed in its chapel. The congregation gathered, candles flickering, as the priest blessed the work. Pareja stood at the back, almost invisible, watching as the faces in the painting seemed to glow in the dim light. For a moment, it must have felt like the world had shifted again. He was not a guest, not a servant, not a curiosity, but the creator of something undeniable. The painting still hangs there today, a testament to a life that refused to be forgotten, each figure caught in the act of becoming something more. What nobody guessed, looking up at that altarpiece, was just how many years of stolen practice, perilous patience, and silent hope had been poured into its making. The transformation was not a single leap, but 1,000 careful steps. Yet, when the moment came, Pareja was ready. He had learned to paint in the shadows, but his masterpiece stood in the light. And there, in that golden glow, the boy from Antiquera, born into bondage, taught to be invisible, became what the world said he could never be, a master whose work would outlast every wall that tried to contain him. Standing in front of Pareja's portrait today, you realize it is not just a window into the 17th century or into one man's improbable defiance, but a mirror for what it means to insist on being seen in a world built to ignore you. The lesson that quietly radiates from his steady gaze is not about the spectacle of overcoming, but about the 1,000 invisible acts that add up to transformation, the patience to watch and wait, the discipline to learn in silence, the courage to risk everything for a skill you might never be allowed to claim. Think about that. Every luminous highlight on his brow, every careful fold of the collar, is a record of endurance, a message painted in oil and pigment that says presence is itself a kind of resistance. Pareja's life was shaped by laws and customs designed to erase people like him, yet his persistence forced the world to redraw its boundaries, even if only by inches. There is something almost electric in the idea that talent, when it appears in the unlikeliest of places, cannot truly be hidden forever. The portrait is proof. It captured not just a likeness, but the very friction between visibility and vulnerability, between recognition and danger. When Velázquez painted Pareja as a subject, neither servant nor ornament, but a man with a story, he did more than break a rule. He set a precedent, one that echoes louder with each century that passes. What nobody guessed, looking at that portrait in Rome or Madrid, or now in New York, is how much of Pareja's real mastery was forged not in moments of glory, but in the relentless, unseen practice of surviving the margins. That is the deeper legacy. Greatness is not always born in light, but often in the disciplined darkness where hope is kept alive by sheer will. The world changed only slightly with each of his achievements, but that is how real change begins, incremental, almost invisible, until suddenly the old certainties no longer hold. Pareja's story reframes the way we think about genius and opportunity. It asks us to recognize that the brightest talents may be those who have had to work hardest just to be noticed, and that the structures meant to keep people out sometimes end up forging the very resilience they hope to crush. His transformation reminds us that recognition is powerful, but what matters even more is the readiness born in obscurity, the quiet confidence that comes from learning every detail of a craft before anyone is willing to believe you can master it. The portrait that astonished Rome is not just a record of artistic skill, but a challenge to history. It dares us to look again at all the voices, hands, and eyes that have been pushed to the edge of the canvas, and to wonder what is lost when we let silence stand in for absence. Pareja's legacy is not simply that he broke through, but that he did so without bitterness, building a life that spoke for itself when words and signatures were not allowed. The mark he left is indelible, not because it was loud, but because it was earned, each brushstroke a quiet refusal to disappear. In the end, his story teaches us that being seen is not the finish line, but the first step in making the world big enough to hold every hidden talent. And that sometimes to change what people believe is possible, you only need to hold your ground long enough for the light to shift. Think about that. Centuries later, you can still stand before his portrait and meet the steady gaze of a man who was never meant to be seen, his presence undimmed, his story quietly refusing to fade. What nobody guessed was that a single act of looking could echo so far, the light from that Roman studio reaching all the way to your own eyes, here and now. In the hush of the museum, the world falls away, and there he is, still watching, still waiting, still impossibly present. Pareja's journey reminds us that sometimes the world will not see your worth until someone else insists on looking closer. Think about the risks he took, and the patience it demanded to keep preparing in secret for a chance that might never come. Before you go, ask yourself, when your chance arrives, will you be ready to claim it? Share your thoughts below, and let us keep discovering these hidden histories together.